Hello and welcome. I'm Terry Martin. I'm a television news journalist based here in Berlin. It's my great honor to be back here at the World Forum for the panel on dissidents, the role of dissidents in advancing democratic movements. I had this great pleasure to be here last year doing something very similar. This year we have an amazing group of experienced dissidents assembled on the stage, and we hope that there will be one joining us virtually in a moment. Many of these faces will be familiar to you if you follow democratic movements and the cause of democracy, particularly in autocratic countries and countries where there are dictatorships. I'm going to introduce each of them very briefly, and I'm going to then introduce our two keynote speakers along with them, and we'll get a discussion going. At the end of this hour, the last 15 minutes or so, I hope to open up the floor to questions from you. So without further ado, in the middle, Vladimir Kara-Murza is a Russian opposition leader, a human rights advocate, a politician, and an author. I'm pretty sure that everyone here knows him. I think he's got an award coming his way this evening. Lyubov Sobol is, I hope, going to be joining us virtually if we get the connection set up. She's a Russian political and public figure advocating for the democratization of Russia. Also with us, a Russian-American documentary filmmaker, director and producer of the 2018 Academy Award shortlisted film Women of the Gulag, Mariana Yarovskaya. I hope I'm Yarovskaya. Please forgive my pronunciation. Omar Alshogre is a Syrian refugee, public speaker, human rights activist. We've had the pleasure of speaking before on subjects related to what we're talking about today. Director of Detainee Affairs at the Syrian Emergency Task Force. Also with us, Marina Ovsyannikova, Russian journalist, television producer, and opposition figure. Also Gennady Gudkov, Russian opposition politician, also familiar to many of you. I believe we bumped into each other at the Warsaw Security Conference at time.
Yeah, that's it.
Lisa Samoilova is a member of Pussy Riot and an activist, as is Lucy Stein, a member of Pussy Riot, who is sitting right next to it. But I think we were here together last year for the dissident session. Yeah. Exactly. So we're going to have two quick keynotes, like I say, and then we're going to open up the table to everyone here on stage. Vladimir Kara-Murza, would you get things going?
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's here, and of course, I want to thank the Cinema for Peace Foundation for bringing together this amazing forum. And thank you for holding especially this session about the dissident movement. This year is actually a kind of a jubilee year, anniversary year for the Russian dissident movement, because it was born in 1965, exactly 60 years ago. Its birth date is considered to be the 5th of December 1965, which was Constitution Day back then in the Soviet Union. The famous or infamous Stalin's constitution, adopted in 1937, that was described by the Soviet propaganda as the most progressive, the most democratic constitution in the world. And one of its authors, Nikolai Bukharin, the main author, was actually arrested and executed within a year of that constitution's adoption. And so that year, on the 5th of December 1965, a group of dissidents led by Vladimir Bukovsky, who's a legendary dissenter, author, long-term political prisoner who spent almost 12 years in the Soviet Gulag, and Alexander Yesenin-Volpin, who was a mathematician, a philosopher, a poet, a son of the great poet Sergei Yesenin. They decided to stage a demonstration on Pushkin Square on Constitution Day, the 5th of December. And the main slogan that they chose for that demonstration was, "Respect your own constitution." Уважайте свою конституцию. And this became sort of the informal, unofficial motto of the Soviet dissident movement for decades and decades, because sort of the peculiar but also the very, I think, defining feature of the Russian and Soviet dissident movement was that they were not against the laws. They were actually in favor of them. It was a state that was violating its own laws and its own constitution. That demonstration was, of course, very quickly dispersed by the KGB and their Komsomol helpers. Bukovsky had actually been arrested the day before the demonstration, so he wasn't even able to go there. But this was a day when a genie was let out of the bottle. This was the first opposition demonstration in Moscow since the 1920s, the first in 4 decades. But it would give rise to a tradition that would not stop until the end of the Soviet regime itself. The other dissident demonstration in the Soviet Union that was perhaps even more famous than the 1965 one took place on the 25th of August 1968. That was, of course, the time when the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact states invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring. And the Soviet government wanted to very carefully craft an image, a propaganda image of total unanimity in the Soviet Union in support of this action, of this invasion, because they didn't call it invasion, they called it brotherly assistance. Just like today, you cannot call the war in Ukraine a war, you're supposed to call it a special military operation. And just as today, Putin's propaganda machine is trying to craft this artificial and totally false propaganda image of universal public support in Russia for what's going on. So they did back then. All across the Soviet Union, there were meetings held at factories, academic institutes, trade unions, cultural organizations, and so on, and everybody would vote in favor. We approve of the brotherly assistance. And Soviet newspapers reported that support for that invasion was unanimous. And then something happened on that day, that afternoon on the 25th of August. 7 people came out onto Red Square in Moscow, a very symbolic place, to protest against the crushing of the Prague Spring, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And they brought the slogan that did become the motto of the dissident movement over the decades in the Soviet Union, and that continues to be voiced and brought on placards around rallies today. За вашу и нашу свободу, for your freedom and ours. That was a poster that Pavel Litvinov brought, one of the 7 to that demonstration. Of course, they were all beaten up, arrested, and herded away almost immediately. And all of the demonstrators, every single one of them, for those 5 minutes on Red Square, paid a very heavy price, with years in the gulags, or forced internal exile, or psychiatric institution, which was the worst of all. But after what they did, and this is, I remember many, many years later, but also now many years ago, 2004, 2005, I was making a documentary film about the Soviet dissident movement. It was called They Chose Freedom, a 4-part film. It's publicly available. And one of the people I interviewed for that film was Natalia Gorbanevskaya. She was a poet, she was a translator, an author herself, and she was one of the 7. And she was a mother of 2 young kids, including one who was a baby, and she actually brought him to Red Square. And I remember asking her about the demonstration. I first asked her why she went, what caused her to make that decision. And she said that to me, going onto that demonstration was a selfish act. She said, I wanted to have a clean conscience. I'll never forget those words, because when the Soviet regime tried to create an image that this crime of aggression was being committed on behalf of the entire nation, she said, well, I'm not okay with this, so I need to do something about it. And she also said, and I'll never forget that either, she said, the nation minus even one person, minus me, that's not an entire nation. And there were 7 of us there. So after what we did, she said nobody could claim that there was nationwide universal support in the Soviet Union for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And she was absolutely right, because a few days after that demonstration, a Prague journal, Literárne listy, while Soviet tanks were rolling on the streets of Prague, they came out with an editorial in which they said, we now have at least 7 reasons for which we will never be able to hate the Russian people. And so those 7 people in 1968 really did save the honor and the dignity of our entire country, of our entire nation. Now, one of the questions here for our panel discussion is, what role, what significance for the dissidents? To me, frankly, I'd struggle to find anything more significant than saving the honor and the dignity of an entire country. And as we know from history, it can take only a handful of people to do that. And when I think about the impact and the legacy that the Soviet dissident movement left us, I think it is primarily that. They showed that it's possible, even in a repressive, criminal, cruel, totalitarian regime that was the Soviet Union, equipped with the world's most perfect, most effective machine of repression that was the Soviet KGB. They showed that it was still possible to stand up and say, I'm not okay with this. And the main lesson to me of the Soviet dissident movement was that they showed to all of us that fear, at the end of the day, is an individual choice. Yes, these regimes will rule by fear. They will want to instill fear. This is their main instrument of maintaining their control. But at the end of the day, as the Soviet dissidents showed us, it is up to every individual person to decide whether he or she wants to be afraid or not. And they chose not to be. And today, there are many, many people in Russia who also chose not to be afraid of, publicly spoken out against the war in Ukraine, and who are in prison now because of it. We have a record number of political prisoners in the post-Soviet history of Russia today. The latest figure, I just checked it out while coming to this panel, 1,524. This is only the publicly available list from human rights groups. Having been inside the system myself, I can tell you there are people who are not on anybody's list, who are not on anybody's radars, of whom nobody has ever heard. So the actual numbers are much, much higher. But even the figure we have, 1,524, this is according to OVD Info, one of Russia's leading human rights organizations. This is more than the whole of the Soviet Union, so that is 15 countries put together, had in the mid-1980s towards the end of the Soviet regime. We have more today in Russia than the whole of the Soviet Union had in terms of political prisoners. And of course, on the one hand, this is a horrendous sign of the level and the scale of repression in Putin's Russia. But it also shows, on the other hand, that there are many people in our country who are choosing to speak out, who are choosing not to succumb to this fear, and who are saying, I'm not okay with this. And if those 7 people in 1968 managed to stand up for the dignity of honor of a whole nation, then surely the thousands and thousands of people who have been detained by police, handled with administrative charges, or actually put in prison under a criminal case for speaking out against the war in Ukraine, inside of Russia since February of 2022, these people certainly are saving the dignity and the honor of our country. And to me, this is the main impact, the main legacy, the main influence of the dissident movement. As Andrea Malrik, a prominent historian, writer, himself a very well-known dissident, said, what Soviet dissidents did was something that was very simple and very brilliant at the same time. In a country that was not free, they decided to behave like free people. And so doing, he said, they changed the moral atmosphere. And when I look at the collapse of the Soviet regime in the late 80s, early 90s, of course we cannot say that it was caused only by the dissident movement. Of course not. There were many different factors. There were foreign policy factors. First and foremost, the principled stand that President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher took with regard to the Soviet regime. There were economic factors with the rapid decline in the prices of oil. That was the main source of budgetary revenue for the Soviet Union. Many, many other factors, of course, as well. But to me, it was the Soviet dissidents, the handful of people that they were, that morally prepared our society for that change, that morally prepared our society for the thought that this is not okay, the way things are happening in our country under this regime. And it was those very same teenagers who in the late 70s, early 80s would read samizdat pamphlets, would listen to Radio Liberty programs. When they were 30 and 30-something, it was these same people who went to the barricades at the Moscow White House in August 1991 to defend democracy against the hardline coup d'etat attempt. And to me, this is one of the most optimistic lessons. The history of the Soviet dissident movement was one of the most optimistic lessons from the history of the 20th century. It showed that even a handful of people, when they're willing and ready to stand up for their dignity and their freedom and for what they believe in, they can prove stronger than a mighty totalitarian state and a mighty machine of repression. And that was actually this knowledge. I'm a historian by education. One of my specialty was the study of the Soviet dissident movement. I had the honor of knowing many of these people personally, people like Vladimir Kara-Murza and Alexander Yesenin-Volpin and Natan Sharansky and many others. And that was actually one of the things that really helped sustain myself in prison, because when I was reading these dissident books and memoirs, everything that they lived through, I was living through. Everything was exactly the same down to the last details. But we knew how that story ended. And we know that the system will end in exactly the same way, because a system based on lies cannot survive forever. The favorite toast that the dissidents would always give it, when they gathered together, the first toast would always be «За успех нашего безнадежного дела», for the success of a hopeless cause. But as we know very well after what happened in 1991 in our country, the cause was not that hopeless after all.
Thank you very much. You mentioned mentioned radio liberty as being within your talk there as a voice of information that was valuable for people living in that context where they might not have had access to that kind of information otherwise. I'm sure as many people in this room know, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia are being shut down as we speak by the new administration.
Yeah, not by the KGB, by the United States government.
By the United States government, exactly.
On a day like this in 2011, the children in Syria, southern Syria, decided to write on the walls of their school, "Jayik الدور يا دكتور," your turn is coming, doctor, referring to the president of Syria then, Bashar al-Assad. And for those small words on the walls, the kids were arrested. And then they were taken to prison, they were tortured, and their parents heard in advance of their torture, so they decided to go out to the street in front of the intelligence service branches and ask for their kids. In solidarity, my hometown raised. All the people went out to the street. You know, my hometown is 30,000 people. You had 30,000 people on the street. Women, men, children, schools shut down, everything. Everybody was on the street. It was my first time being in a demonstration. I had no clue what was going on. Like, I didn't really understand politics. I was 15 years old. And then I was taken to prison. I grew up learning that the police protects the people. You know, I never understood what intelligence service would do to protect the president. And then I was tortured. And then a few days later, I was released. And nothing can teach you the meaning of freedom better than prison. It's fantastic in that regard. It teaches you how important it is. So when I was released, I decided to be on the street because I couldn't just go back home. And with the time, we started to see the army that is supposed to be our army killing us. They killing my friends. They bombing my school. Every helicopter that's flying, every aircraft that's flying is bombing us. The only thing we could, you stop thinking about planes as a beautiful thing to see in the sky or take a picture of. It became a source of danger. If a plane is flying over you, you may die. And all the children in Syria have started to connect planes to death. And it became at some point when Russia, started getting engaged in Syria and bombing the Syrian people since 2015, the only thing you could connect to plane was the bomb, nothing else. Then I was taken to prison again. And in prison, they isolate you. They don't isolate you by putting you away from people. They put you in the middle between a lot of people. But we're not allowed to speak because they don't want you to build any sort of relationship with any prisoner because they don't want you to build any sort of empathy. So you would sit in a square surrounded by a lot of squares between a lot of prisoners in a very tiny, you're in a squatting position. And then you're not allowed to speak and you're not allowed to come close to the door because the door of your cell is the closest thing to freedom you have. You're not allowed to come close to the door, and you're not allowed even under torture to scream. And you're not allowed to, one of the rules they tell you when you get into prison in Syria, it's very common. God is in the basement under the ground in a cell. Don't call for him for help. He's not coming for you. So they try to eliminate, the relationships, the hope, and the fantasy of you at some point getting out of that place for years. And I always think that I grew up in prison because I was 15, then 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. All these years I spent most of them in prison. So I grew up there in a way, but the most magnificent thing that was happening is the fact that in those prisons, you don't have criminals. You have the top people of your country. And one of the biggest mistakes of this criminal is putting the doctors, the engineers, the psychologists, the authors, the mathematicians. Those people, usually don't get them around a dinner table. Suddenly they all sitting within a few meters in a cell, and they sharing knowledge for survival. So that doctor would take care of my wounds, and he would teach me how to take care of my wounds and his. So when he's injured, I would do that to him. And then the psychologist, how to handle your trauma. Suddenly you end up in the most productive, safe environment in a bigger, miserable environment of torture and starvation. And in the darkest moments ever, it's when things became suddenly beautiful. I was announced for execution, and then I was taken to execution in June of 2015, and they put me on the ground, they load, they aim, then poof, and I never died before. It was the first time I'm dying, so I had no idea how it feels. Is it painful? Is it not? So when they shot, I thought that I died and it didn't hurt. I was so excited about the idea that it didn't hurt and I have a sense of life, which means I'm in heaven already. That was awesome feeling. Until I woke up and realized I was still alive. And it was a mock execution because my mom managed to bribe everyone in the system to smuggle me out on my execution day. In the darkest moment of my time, when I was about to die, I was smuggled. And the years have passed and we had to do work on a daily basis. And to keep it short, I never imagined that the planes that have been bombing the Syrians for so many years would be doing something else. You know, a few days ago, on March 15th, was the anniversary of the Syrian Revolution. It's what all started. And the planes, the Syrian helicopters were flying in Damascus, dropping flowers on leaves, telling people, we're here to protect you. There's nothing more emotional than that. Because the fact that we managed to bring down a dictator that has the support of Russia, militarily and financially, also China and some Arab countries, neighboring countries, and and the U.S. did nothing to do it. The West did nothing. They, of course, welcomed refugees, and that's something we're very grateful for, but they did actually nothing to help. It helped us realize that in the end, you have to mainly focus on yourself. Really depending on other countries to help you in your cause is not a sustainable strategy, because you really rely on yourself, but then you can get some extra help from external, because no ally is reliable, and we can see that with the United States. It's not reliable because politics change and democracies change, leaderships and opinions change. So with time, we realized that we have to rely on ourselves, and we managed to bring down the dictator that has killed 1 million people. When I was released in 2015, there was 250,000 political prisoners remaining in Syrian prisons. And then when the regime fell and all the prisons were opened on the 8th of December, only 20,000 people were found from 250,000. So a lot of people died for us to live that day that we're living in Syria, the feeling of freedom. And I am so excited for the day that we can celebrate that in Russia too. The day when Ukraine wins its war, and the day when, the Palestinian people can get free, and all of that. It's going to be a moment of joy that I'm very excited to share with the people that will be celebrating it. Thank you.
Very powerful message. Thank you. Now, thank you very much, both of you, for very inspiring opening statements that gave us insights into what it's like to be a dissident and how to still maintain hope and courage in the face of really horrible circumstances that both of you have dealt with.
So I had to leave Russia in 2021 because our team, Alexei Navalny's organization, was labeled as extremist, and I was put on list of terrorists and extremists, and several politically motivated cases were opened against me and my colleagues, and we left Russia. And but the main wave of immigration from Russia started after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I want to note that most of those who left, hundreds or thousands of people, are young. And once they manage to settle in a new country, they often join human rights and other activist projects. And I remember how at the beginning of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, Russians abroad helped Ukrainian refugees. And many Russians who left face difficulties in Europe. They are often denied residence permits or bank accounts just because they have a Russian passport. And however, in my opinion, Russian immigrants are among the most adaptable people. They are willing to integrate in local culture, learn languages, and follow the rules of new countries. And what do Russians abroad do? And there are two main areas of focus. First, there are media projects aimed at the Russian audience, every day, millions of people inside Russia watch YouTube and read Telegram news from independent journalists and opposition politicians to learn what is really happening in Russia, in the world, in the war in Ukraine. Because all newspapers, all TV channels, all radio channels inside Russia are controlled by Kremlin, so YouTube and Telegram remain key sources of independent news. And the second area is human rights projects that help people who are still in Russia. For example, Russian immigrant software engineers in Silicon Valley volunteer for OVD Info. It's a project that helps people detained by the Putin's police for political reasons. And they monitor detentions and offer legal assistance to those people. And last but not least, what I want to mention today, that those who left Russia are in fact its civil society. Even though they are now live in exile, I believe they are the real future of our country. Thank you.
My English is not so good, but I have some advantages. I was born in the middle of the past century, and I knew many Russian dissidents personally, and I understood what they were doing when we all lived in the Soviet Union. You know, what I won't tell my history, of course, as many of us recognized as a terrorist, extremists, foreign agents, and so on. As usual, several criminal cases. What I would like to, I try to say what should be done. Because we, dissidents in the Soviet Union, these were tens of people, very courageous, very brave, but they were marginalized by the Soviet regime, declared as insane, etc. So they could not, they have not any possibility to address to Soviet people. Because it was too risky, it was almost impossible. Now we live in just the other way, digitalized world. We have a lot of social media, internet, etc. For example, of course, the influence of Soviet dissidents were very great. For example, I remember very well, and my generation as well. For example, musical programs of Sevan Obgorodsky on Voice of America, by the way. He formed the new way of thinking of the younger generation. During these musical programs, he made not less than sanctions against the Soviet Union after its invasion to Afghanistan. To my mind, it's my opinion. Now we live in the other world. We have much more possibilities. We estimate people who left the country by political reasons, I mean these 3 years, not less than 1 million. All of them are a lot of them are very creative people. Artists, writers, poets, etc., etc., etc. These people can fight against Putin's regime. Almost all of us, we have our own audience in Russia. This audience is 10 of millions of Russians living in the country now. And they listen to us, they follow us, because we give them the perception of normality. Because for them it's very important to understand that they are not alone, that they think correctly, and we support them. But the Soviet Union was won in the Cold War not only by efforts of Soviet dissidents. Who won the Soviet Union? Of course, the coalition of Western countries. Who had strategy, plans, budgets, etc., and support? Churchill made his speech in year 1947-46, and that was the plan how to win the Soviet Union and communism, which was very dangerous for the whole world. If you ask me what is done now, I could say almost nothing. If we ask now how many Russian editions exist now in Europe, 1 or 2, maybe in Great Britain, BBC, and private Russian edition built in Germany. That's all. That is all. So we, of course, I mean Russian politicians, public figures, we have our own, many of us, have our own, for example, YouTube channels. But we do not have big media, like Voice of America, like your Freedom of Europe, Svoboda Europe, Radio Freedom, etc. So, to my mind, the task of democratic coalition now is to work out the new conception and perception of containing Russia, so to say. We won't win Putin without it. To join our efforts, to give Russians, dissidents, let it be dissidents, the possibility to address the population in Russia, to fight against Putin's absolutely aggressive propaganda. That is our task. That we can do right now, tomorrow, yesterday.
It sounds like that's already happening to some degree.
No.
But you were saying that there's not a sufficient volume of it, because we've just heard that there are people who are their YouTube channels who are working towards that. But you're saying it lacks the volume.
I talked to the officials in the European Commission. Of course, they do much. They told me that they support independent Russian media, about 30% of their budget. I think, of course, they do this work, and this work is very important, of course. But if we say of a strategy against Putin's regime, we don't have it. We lost 3 years of this war. We lost this time. We wasted this time because we did not work out any strategy what to do with Russia, what to do with Putin, who will fight with him, who will undermine his regime from inside. We don't have allies now, almost now, in Putin's elites, in Putin's surrounding. How can we win Putin now? Maybe somebody will tell us, will give us the plan, clear understanding of how to win Putin. Tomorrow we will discuss, it will be the panel discussion, Russia after Putin.
Yeah.
Are you sure that Russia will, of course, when it can happen?
I've moderated a panel on that
Yes,
topic.
we can continue this talk tomorrow. That is why, to my mind, what is main idea I would like to express? It's time to work out strategy to Russia, to Putin's regime, and to find proper ways and methods to win it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mariana, do you see that as well, that while there are individuals who are working outside of Russia to try to communicate with the people who are inside Russia and counter the propaganda that is coming through in Russian media about what's going on in the world, we need to take those voices and achieve some sort of critical mass in order to help drive the dissident movement or the people to stand up against Putin's regime? How do you see it?
I think that one of the ways to bring people together this way is to continue the dialogue, and one of the ways to continue this dialogue is tell the stories. I'm here partially due to, and I'm very thankful for Cinema for Peace for supporting my film about Luba Sobot. So I'm here partially about because I made a film about Luba, and I believe that telling a story of a dissident in a way that it touches people emotionally could be one of the ways that the artists, for example, can support the dissident movement.
But within Russia, how would you get that story about the dissidents to the people who might be inspired by it?
I think that if the story is good enough, it will find its way to the Russians in Russia. And I think there is a long history of artists and philosophers who were dissidents a century ago, like we had Nabokov, and we had Bunin, and we had Kuprin, and we had writers, for example, who fled Russia in 1917 and are now, later and are now considered Russian as well. So they became a part of Russian culture, yet everything they created was created abroad. So I think it doesn't matter where the story is created. If it's good enough and strong enough, it will reach the audience. I think Luba is working with connecting with the Russians in Russia more in the field. And I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do a story that will be alive 10 years down the line.
The storytellers in the world I think there is a reference from poetry, the unacknowledged legislators of the world, right? So the people who tell these stories are absolutely critical to shaping what happens in a political sense as well.
I think your story needs to be told as well. Has anybody made a film?
Working on it.
He's only 29, I think, so there's still some time. Marina, you obviously you work in television. You're a journalist. You're familiar with the media landscape and, of course, the political environment very much in Russia. We're talking a lot about Russia, but not just about Russia. We're trying to find examples here in our discussion with experienced dissidents that could be of an inspiration to other dissidents who are trying to drive the democratic movement in various countries. What would your message be to those who are trying to push the democratic envelope under very difficult circumstances?
First of all, I have never imagined I will be sitting here in the group Dissidents and talking and speaking publicly against Putin's regime. But when the war started, it was 3 years ago, for me it was point of no return, because I can't keep silence anymore, and I start to protesting on live broadcast. Maybe you know, I think everybody knows this picture.
Where you stood up in the studio on a live
Yes,
television
yes,
broadcast,
yes.
held up a sign that was critical of the regime.
Yeah, it was for me. It was point of no return. I was working in this propaganda machine so many years, and cognitive dissonance between reality and what we have to say on our broadcast was growing and growing and growing. For 25 years, Putin destroyed all independent media in Russia. Instead of that, he built a strong propaganda machine who are working according Goebbels' philosophy, constantly calling black white. And when the war started, I just realized enough, it's enough, and I started protesting against war and against this propaganda machine. And now, the second time of my life, I'm a refugee. The first time it was after the first Chechen war started. Russian troops destroyed my house in Grozny, and I was a refugee when I was a child. I was a refugee so many years, and now I'm political refugee in France. I'm very grateful France because they really saved my life, and not only my life, they also saved the life of my daughter, because when Russian authorities finally arrested me, they put me under house arrest, and I had only one way to, I immediately understand, if I want to save my life, I have to escape from Russia, and we crossed the border illegally. Yeah, it was really difficult escape, and finally now when I am free and I'm abroad, I understand my mission fighting against Putin's propaganda, against disinformation, against constant lying what Kremlin provide for all Russians. And now we are with a British documentary company, we start to creating a documentary about propaganda and how Russians live inside under pressure of this propaganda from different sides. Our project is still continuing. It's not finished yet. We are just looking at some money, just continue this project. And also, I'm participating inside in the another project together with Reporters Without Border. We create some satellite who provide independent information for Russians, and this satellite called Svoboda satellite, and we just provide special signal on Russian territory, and Russian can watch some independent TV channels.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, it's the work that you've done and are doing is clearly important. The statement that you made regarding why you stood up in that television studio and couldn't stand it anymore. You had to say, no, black is not white. Don't believe the lie. This is I find really interesting. There's going to be a panel tomorrow, by the way, on the language of demagogues, right? So there's going to be a whole separate panel on this topic, and this notion of saying that one thing is, say, black is white and white is black, and you know that's not true, and you had to stand up and say that. We're seeing a similar situation. Apparently this is a common tactic, and we're seeing it in many circumstances, not least in the United States right now, that's equally disturbing. Anyway, we'll be following that up tomorrow, very much so. So we just have a couple of panels before I open up the floor to the audience for questions. Lucy Stein, member of Pussy Riot, activist, very much involved in exile now, trying to continue your work, your protest work. Tell us about it.
About my work?
Apparently we have the people from the next panel already wanting to get going, so we're going to try to wrap this up as best we can. I'm not sure if you're aware that we had a medical emergency in here just before this started, so that's why we started late. My apologies for us moving past time. Actually, we began at the time that we were supposed to end, so that's where we are. Please.
Thank you. Now I'm working in human rights, but I actually like to share some thoughts on how Western countries could influence the current situation in Russia. First, the West should stop being hypocritical about Putin. Publicly they condemn him, but in reality they still help his war machine. They ignore loopholes in sanctions. They let him keep trading. They allow resources to flow, and this money funds the war. If the West truly wants to stop Putin, it must stop doing business with him. The policy of being concerned doesn't work anymore. At the same time, many sanctions don't work as they should. They hurt ordinary Russians, those who try to resist the regime. They make life harder for political refugees, but they don't affect the oligarchs, the officials, or those who actually benefit from Putin's system. Even actual murderers, like the security forces of the head of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, continue to travel freely in Europe. These men torture and kill people. They're committing gay purges. They have homes and businesses in the West. They send their families abroad. Then they go back to Russia and continue to torture and murder. Meanwhile, their victims face endless obstacles. Second, it's crucial to counter Trump's destructive foreign policy. He admires Putin. He weakens support for Ukraine. He damages US commitments to its allies. If the West doesn't act fast to limit the damage, the result could be catastrophic, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire world. One more thing, those who resist Putin inside Russia are running out of time. They need help. Their lives are in danger. Take deserters, for example. The word deserter often sounds negative, but in this war, these people made an incredibly brave choice. They risk everything, home, family, freedom, to refuse to bring destruction to foreign land. Supporting them and other victims, political prisoners, human rights defenders, activists, is not just about their safety, it's about justice. Their testimonies must be considered in international courts. They should be recognized as witnesses of crimes. This will help to lay the groundwork for future trials. Speaking of the legal framework, Russia has never faced real accountability for crimes against humanity. There was no Nuremberg for Soviet or Putin's crimes. KGB archives remain classified. Propaganda still twists history. The international community must keep documenting human rights violations and holding those responsible accountable. It may feel pointless right now as Russia rejects international law today, but the rulings of the ICC, the ECHR, and our courts remain valid. One day, Russia will want to return to the international system, and when that time comes, following these rules should be a mandatory condition. It's also important to grant Russian human rights defenders access to universal jurisdiction mechanisms. Even if Putin himself never ends up on trial, even if some war criminals escape justice, the process of recording and exposing these crimes must continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a well-crafted statement with many different aspects to it that I'm sure we could expand upon endlessly today. But no, some really good points there. I don't think I need to embellish at all. So finally, Lisa Samoilova. And we're aware that there's time pressure.
We want to talk
here.
about implementing that.
We're aware that there's time pressure here. So at 20 after, I plan to wrap it up. That will have been 1 hour.
I'm going to be brief, I promise.
No problem.
Many opposition-minded individuals try to escape authoritarian regimes, but sometimes even those who succeed in doing so still feel the reach of their authoritarian governments. According to this year's Freedom House report, almost 1/4 of the world's governments, 48 states, use the tactics of transnational repression. But only 10 countries are responsible for nearly 80% of all recorded physical attacks since 2014. Amongst these countries are Egypt, China, Turkey, and Russia. Cooperation between governments enables this kind of repression. Authorities in host countries, both authoritarian and democratic, enabled over 800 incidents since 2014, acting on politically motivated Interpol notices, approving dubious extraditions, and sometimes even allowing kidnappings. Some countries have picked up the issue of protecting exile dissidents, but much more needs to be done. On the other hand, some dissidents need to stay, or at least to communicate with their fellow citizens. In today's Russia, the widespread conformism and apathy that Soviet-era dissidents once faced have reappeared, but there are still people resisting the regime from within. Though dissident initiatives and organizations abroad play an important role in international human rights advocacy, we should remember that the push for democracy in Russia won't come from those who have left, but from those who remain. Of course, financial aid and programs that enable collaboration between Western and Russian civil society organizations are vital. But the West must more actively complement its existing strategy towards Russia with counter-propaganda, which, unlike propaganda, relies on facts. It is crucial to combat disinformation, particularly among the younger generation, to help them understand the value of democracy. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is the divide between those who left and those who are still in the country. Exiles often live in their own bubble, while those who remain in Russia, despite opposing the regime, feel forgotten. Bridging this gap is critical. The situation might seem hopeless sometimes, but we must not lose faith. Sometimes, even in their darkest moments, protest movements can reinvent themselves. Russian history is full of unexpected turns, which means an unexpected turn towards democracy is also possible. Thank you.
Just for anyone in the room who doesn't know that you still live in Russia. So
Yes, I do. I'm going back to Moscow at the end of the month.
I'm profoundly moved by your testimonies.
if you could just identify yourself.
My name is Jonathan Granoff. I'm the president of the Global Security Institute. I mainly focus on the rule of law as it relates to weapons of mass destruction.
Thank you.
I'm profoundly moved by your testimonies. I would like to ask a question. It's more along the lines of personal inspiration. I'd like if you and particularly you to talk about the wellspring of courage and how you acquired that, and just share a little bit of that precious, extraordinarily valuable human quality that I've never faced the kind of challenges that you have. I was a protester against the Vietnam War. There was some degree of challenge, tear gas, things like that. But what you faced is breathtakingly horrible, and yet you seem to be extraordinarily balanced, positive, healthy human beings. And I just find that to be extraordinarily needed in my country, where we're going to need some degree of courage. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the resilience and fortitude that you've demonstrated. It's not ego, it's really asking something of you that is extraordinary and valuable.
I understand.
And thank you.
I think imagine that we said the former regime in Syria actually didn't give you a choice. You had to be courageous or die. You couldn't do anything but actually be on the street, because if you don't go on the street, you end up with that dictatorship that will kill you. And then in prison, when they were torturing us, we didn't have an option but to carry each other back to the room. And then, year after year of killing, we realized that this regime will give you no choice. But at some point, there is, I think, pain has been a source of power somehow. They put you under so much pressure and pain that you realize that this life is definitely not worth it. There is no form of justice unless I keep fighting to get freedom, because you realize at some point that freedom is worth all this suffering. I can tell you today, as the feeling of today, I lost my father, my brothers, and they were killed in massacres. My school, my childhood friends were killed. Like, I lost a lot in Syria. Then instead of being in high school, I was in prison, and it's massacres. The whole country has been massacred. But I can tell you, it's very unfortunate that we went through all the miserable things we went through, but it's all worth the beautiful day we saw the other day when the planes in Syria were dropping flowers on the people in Damascus. It's worth everything. It's worth all the pain, the suffering, the pulling out of nails, the bleeding day after day in prison. It was worth it, to see the beautiful and the strength of people crying of joy. The power of crying of joy is unmatchable, and I love it. I don't have much to say than that, but it's worth it. I think the reason is people continue. It's because they know it's worth it. Even if it takes 50 years, 60 years of fighting, it's always worth it to achieve the dreams of freedom and democracy that you want. That's why people keep going.
Thank you very much, Omar.
Thank you.
I never think of this in terms of courageous, and all these grand words. It's just, well, first of all, I always say I'm stubborn, not courageous. That's different. But you have to be if you're a Russian opposition politician. But on the substance of your question, look, I've been doing what I'm doing for 25 years. I came to work with Boris Nemtsov, who was the opposition leader in Russia, in November of 1999. As you know, he was assassinated by Putin 10 years ago in front of the Kremlin. I've been in politics for 25 years. I'm a Russian politician. I've always believed that a politician has to be in his or her country. That's not a profession you can do remotely. Lisa was absolutely right when she said that change is going to come from within. And if if I am a public politician, if I identify myself as one of the faces of the opposition, well, I have to be with my fellow citizens in my home country, because what moral right would I have to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up to Putin's dictatorship if I didn't do it myself? I believe that those of us who are politicians have a level of public responsibility that frankly supersedes any notions of, any considerations of personal comfort and personal safety. And so I did not leave Russia after the 2 poisonings that were inflicted on me out of principle, and certainly after Putin invaded Ukraine, when the whole purpose of the regime was to instill massive fear in the citizenry. When in the first days of the invasion they passed these laws criminalizing any anti-war speech. Even calling a war would send you to prison. And especially at moments like this, I believe that's when politicians do have a special responsibility. And I mentioned in the earlier part of our discussion that to me the main lesson from the Soviet dissident movement, that at the end of the day fear is a choice. Yes, the regime will rule by fear, they will try to instill fear, but at the end of the day it's up to each individual citizen to choose whether or not he or she decides to be afraid. I think we should choose not to be afraid, because this is how that regime survives. And the only way to show this is by personal example. I'll never forget how in the mid-2000s there was this initiative in the Russian opposition, which I was a part of, nominating Vladimir Bukovsky, the prominent dissident and writer and long-time political prisoner, for president of Russia. This was, of course, a symbolic initiative in a way, because we knew he's not going to be allowed on the ballot, and he wasn't. But that was besides the point. The point was to show that, if these guys are going to install a KGB regime on us, we're going to put up our own Václav Havel. The Russian Václav Havel is Bukovsky. And we had a rally on Mayakovsky Square, Triumphальная Square, which is where the Soviet dissident movement originated back in the day. And after the rally was over, a woman walked up to Bukovsky and asked him, "Why did you come back?" He lived in the West for many years. "Why did he come back here? Are you expecting to change anything?" And he said, no, of course I'm not. But he said, and I was standing next to him, I heard the whole conversation. He said, "Of course I'm not expecting to change anything. I came back because people are starting to be afraid again. And when people are starting to be afraid, you have to come in, stand next to them and say, here I am. I'm not afraid." I was listening to the conversation, I had goosebumps on my back. When Putin invaded Ukraine and when this massive, overwhelming fear was being instilled, I felt as if I have to stand next to people and say, here I am. I'm not afraid. So just as you were saying, there's really no choice. The regime gives you no choice. I'm a Russian politician. I believe in my country. I want my country to have a better future. I have to be willing to do something about it.
Thank you very much. We only have just like a couple of minutes, so Mariana, do you want to say something?
I wanted to add about personal experiences, because I noticed as a filmmaker that women rarely talk about themselves. I wanted to tell a couple of words about Lyuba Sobol, who actually lived through more than 20 arrests, a month of starvation in protest, who survived the poisoning of her husband by Prigozhin. Her husband survived the poisoning, but that took a toll on Lyuba's family and, of course, on the daughter, who survived a mysterious illness that befell on her in Berlin a couple of years ago, and a murder of her closest friend and ally, Alexei Navalny. Lyuba was his first employee and his close friend and ally. And she didn't want to leave. She was ready to go to prison. And Alexei Navalny was still alive back then. And he said that she would be more useful if she goes abroad. And this is what she did in the last moment, in a very narrow window of opportunity, when her bracelet on the foot was taken off and she was able to flee the country in that week before her trial began. She's facing 20 years in prison if she comes back, and she's deemed a terrorist and an extremist. And I think that she's a woman of incredible courage, and sort of, I view this as a continuation in a way of my film Women of the Gulag, which was actually supported by Vladimir Bukovsky at the Academy of Motion Pictures. So I actually wanted to say a couple of words, because I know Lyuba will not.
I want to thank all of our speakers today, also everyone who's joined us in the room for this conversation. A warm round of applause for our speakers.